Welcome to the Urban Farmer Rewind. I'm Diego, D-I-E-G-O. This is a show where we look back at previous episodes of the Urban Farmer. This week, we're looking at Season 1, Week 4. And Curtis and I talked a lot about business in this episode, and that's really what the focus of it'll be. So here's some of my key takeaways that I pulled out of this one. Pricing and sales strategy. One thing that I found interesting back then, and I still do now, was Curtis had maintained relatively the same prices for about 5 years. He was still doing a lot of the 1 for 3, 2 for 5 pricing. And it's interesting because even if you go to a farmer's market today in 2025, you can see that pricing still in effect. Now, the unit size may change, so bunches of radishes might have gotten smaller and baskets of cherry tomatoes might get a little less full to accommodate for rising costs and inflation, because things are definitely more expensive in the world that we live in today due to inflation versus how they were in 2015. But pricing's been pretty stable. And back then, Curtis had maintained prices. He hadn't felt the need to raise prices. He was matching grocery store prices and trying to be around where they were charging. A lot of his strategy was based on this unit-based pricing. And I think most farms are doing that. When I go around my local farmer's market, there are maybe 10 to 15 vegetable vendors. Very few are using a scale to measure with and to price things with. Why is that? Scales, while you can get accurate pricing in terms of you're getting a specific price per unit of weight, you're never giving the customer too much, the customer's never getting too little. You're getting exactly what it weighs for. It costs a lot of time. It's time consuming. If you have to weigh out every unit of produce and they're all different prices, you're weighing everything, you're keeping track of it, you're doing all this math. It's complex. You don't have a nice self-checkout like your local Target does to make these things easy. So as a result of that complexity, a lot of farmers adopt this unit-based pricing, and that's what I see in person. Unit-based pricing is simply you get unit of product for a certain price. 1 for 3, 2 for 5. That could be 1 tomato for 3, 2 tomatoes for 5. It could be 1 cucumber for 3, 2 cucumbers for 5. It could be 1 bunch of radishes and 1 bunch for 3 and 2 bunches of radishes for 5. However you work it. It makes the math much easier. It's also easier for the customer to think about how they're planning out their purchase. Well, if I get 1 of these, I know I'm paying 3. If I get 2, then I'm paying 5. I can understand that math as a customer. When I buy a pound of green beans, most people aren't going to have a concept of how many green beans are in a pound. It was interesting. We went to a local grocery store the other day and we're buying tomatoes, and I don't weigh tomatoes a lot. And my daughter wanted to get some tomatoes, and they were priced per pound. I had no clue. Is this 2 tomatoes? Is it 5 tomatoes? So you weigh it out, and it was about 4 tomatoes per pound, given the size that they were selling. As familiar as I am with the space, and maybe as not familiar as I am with, buying groceries or fresh produce, it was hard to compute. So for buyers, this can be an issue. Now, this could probably work in your favor. There's a reason there's candy stores at the mall and in hotels that charge per pound or per unit weight of candy, because they know kids are going to come in and go nuts, and the candy weighs way more than the amount that it looks. Same thing with these frozen yogurt places. A small cup of yogurt, by the time you put toppings on it, you might not think it's very big. And then you go to check out and you're like, oh my God, this is $12. What's going on here? So they can get you that way, but there's a bit of deception, not intentional, going on because people just can't visualize weights of objects they're not familiar with. We all know what a gallon of milk looks like, or probably a pound of coffee. We know that approximate size. But you tell me how many radishes are in a pound, and unless you're dealing in that on a daily basis, you don't know. So harder for the customer, slower for the farmer, and it makes the transaction more complex because you're now doing a bunch of math to check somebody out. The unit pricing makes it simple because you can also do mix and match. We can just say this whole table, 1 for 3, 2 for 5. It's a little bit harder on a weight basis, although I have talked to U-pick farmers who will do this and say, everything is $3 a pound. So you take your whole basket of what you picked at your U-pick farm, you put it on the scale. If there's all tomatoes in there, $3 a pound. All green beans, $3 a pound. If there's some of everything in there, still $3 a pound. So they've simplified that to go to $3 a pound, and it worked for them. But at a farmer's market, you're not going to do that. You're going to price tomatoes probably at a premium to what you would price radishes at. So on a weight basis, if you try to say everything's $3 a pound, maybe it works. You'd have to run the math, and that might be one strategy to make weight-based pricing work, but that's still going to be hard for the customer to visualize because they're going to pick up a whole bunch of stuff, not really know how much weight they have in their hands, plop it on the scale, and you're going to say, oh, it's $18.92, which is the other weird thing. You get non-even math. So unit-based pricing simplifies things for all parties. It also reduces handling. So if somebody's going to have something weighed, they have to pick it up, give it to you. You have to put it on the scale, weigh it, take it back off the scale, give it to them. If somebody is buying something with a unit pricing, they just show you what they have and you tell them the price, and they've only touched it once, you've never touched it, and they're on their way. So there's less handling of the product. Not a big deal if things are slow, but if you're slammed, if things are busy, if there's a lot of people at your booth and you're working the booth solo, it's a busy market, these little tips and tricks matter. I know there's farmers listening to this that have booths that get really chaotic, and they have 1, 2, 3 people at the booth manning things just because it is so chaotic. If you start adding other steps like weighing, it just further complicates the system. People line up. Now, maybe a line's a good thing because lines tend to attract people, and there's a reason people like to stand in lines. But hey, simplify with unit pricing. Popular strategies, 1 for 3, 2 for 5. I'm also seeing a lot of 1 for 4, 2 for 7, 3 for 10 at my farmer's market. That seems to be a popular strategy. Makes things easy. Another thing Curtis hit on in this one was competing with farmers and how to price product. And I should say, not competing with other farmers, because he wasn't ever trying to do that. And I don't think you should necessarily go out and say, what is my competition selling for? I need to beat them. Oftentimes when you get in a price war like that, it's a race to the bottom. If all of your advantage lies on selling something cheaper than your biggest competitor, that's a possibly short-lived advantage because they can make their processes more efficient. They could cut their own profit margin and just undercut you. And then what do you have left for a choice? If everybody's coming to you because you're the cheapest and you're no longer the cheapest, why are they buying from you? So that's why the race to the bottom concept doesn't work. And you should be aware of what your competitors are charging. You should be aware of the quality of that product so you can price your product accordingly. Based on my experience running Modern Grower, pricing a lot of products over the past 7 years, and talking to farmers on how they price, it definitely needs to be a blend of where's the market and where do you need to be. So where I need to be is based on my costs, which I should know. So if you're selling a unit of something, you need to have a reasonable idea of how much you have into it. This doesn't have to be down to the penny ultra precise. Nobody's auditing you. But if you think it costs $3 to produce and it actually costs $5, that's a problem. If you think it costs $3 and it costs $3.25, not so much of a problem. You want to avoid big errors in your assumptions. And if anything, you want to overestimate costs to maintain your profit margin. So if I think something costs $2.75, let's assume it costs $3 to produce, and I'll price it based on $3. That gives me a little bit of fudge factor. So if I know my costs, now I say, all right, I'm at least selling for that. How much do I want to make? And what will the market bear? What will the market bear is tough to figure out. For common items, which you'll often find at a farmer's market because there's many people selling tomatoes, many people selling carrots, you have an easy reference point. You know what the people in your area will probably pay because other people are selling it in that range. So you can just walk around your farmer's market and other markets in the area and look at carrots and start keeping track of where people selling a bunch of carrots for. $3, $3.50, $3, $3.75, $4, whatever it is. Then you get a rough average. The market's at $4. My cost on that bunch is $2. Am I okay selling at $4? Well, maybe you are, maybe you're not. You might want to increase your profit margin and sell for more. If you sell for more, why are you selling for more? In other words, how is the customer going to justify that? Now, there are some customers who are just going to shop based on price because they're going to see if you line up your carrots and 3 other vendor at your market's carrots, all they see are carrots. They don't distinguish quality, assuming they all look pretty good. And honestly, they probably are all going to look relatively the same, and they're probably all going to taste about the same. And let's assume everybody's growing to the same standards. Organic, no spray, so there's no differentiation there. If everybody's selling at $4 and you want to sell at, say, $6, how are you going to get $6? Why would somebody buy from you for $6? Now, there can be some, again, customer psychology that works in your favor. It's the old wine anomaly where they'll give people different types of wine with no label, and they'll say, all right, try these. Which one tastes the best? And then they pick, B. And then they say, all right, B is actually the least expensive one. Are you sure A doesn't taste better? And they'll say, A tastes better. So people often use price to evaluate quality when they don't have a comparison. If you're familiar with stuff, soda, most people have some concept of how much a can of soda costs. If you see a can of soda for $8, maybe you're at a sporting event or something, but at a grocery store, you're going to say that's crazy. Why am I going to pay that much for Coke? It should be $2, not $8. You have an idea of price. But why wine has all funky pricing and why people associate higher price with better quality is they have no frame of reference. You have somebody try a cheap wine and an expensive wine, there's not necessarily a bell that goes off that says which one is better. They're probably saying these taste like the same thing. So I need something to judge quality off of. Well, if this one's more, it must be better. So this psychology phenomenon could work in your favor. If everybody's selling at $4 and you sell at $5, there may be some customers that are saying, his carrots are $5, everybody else is 4 or some are at 3, they must be better. Doesn't mean they are. Doesn't mean they taste any different. In fact, they could be the same carrots from the $3 booth, but just that pricing anomaly makes it seem more premium. That's one way that people can judge. The other thing you have to think about is, what's your overall presentation? What's your market? Who's buying? If you're at a ritzy or farmer's market, you can probably push the price up. And let's be honest, most small farms are making money from people who are more affluent. They're not selling to low-income people. If you didn't have affluent people willing to go out and support local food, you wouldn't have farmers markets. Farmers markets are arguably a pain in the butt because I have to go there and travel. It's not a one-stop shop. I can't get all my groceries there for the week. I'm going to probably have to go to a grocery store. And if I go to a grocery store, I can get everything I need. I can't at a farmer's market. Farmers markets can be difficult to get to. Their parking can be an issue. It's slower than going to a store. These are reasons why they're less popular than stores. They also tend to be priced more. I go to my local farmer's market. I see a lady selling granola for $12 a bag. I can go to Target and find granola for $4. What's the difference? Ingredients a little bit, but it's really her packaging, her branding, and the fact that it's local and she's selling direct to consumer. And that's the main thing. She has more perceived value in it, but is it any better? Beauty's in the eye of the beholder. So pricing's tough. And I look at a lot of pricing and look at a lot of spreadsheets when I price our things. I usually don't want to be the cheapest, and I usually don't want to be the most expensive. But there is a niche for the cheap product, and there's a niche for the premium product. So you, I think, can play around with this in your market to see what works. Can you go a little bit more expensive than everybody else? And does that convey a little bit more of a premium? If your booth looks nicer, if your display and your signage and your produce looks a little more vibrant, and you're more personable, you might be able to pull it off. The danger of selling for too low is you leave money on the table. If I sell a bunch of carrots for $4, and then I sell a bunch of carrots for $5, and the only difference is the price I charge, I got $1 more when I sold them for $5 by just pricing them at $5. There was no additional work. There was no additional expense. It was simply the number written on the sign. Compound that over multiple bunches of multiple vegetables, over multiple markets, over a season, that's a lot of money. So pricing too light can result in a lot of lost revenue. You probably can get a feel of this if you're not seeing flow to your booth. So if the market itself is busy, you can glance around at other vendors. Now, every vendor has their own little constituency, people that have supported them for years. So just because John Boy over there is really busy, he might be busy because he's been here for 20 years and you've been here for 6 months. You're still building your customer base that resonates with you and your story. He's already done that for 20 years. So it doesn't really matter what his pricing is. His people are never going to come over to you, which is another conversation. Don't expect to convert customers over. You're really picking up new customers to the market, dissatisfied customers with other vendors, or you're selling something other vendors don't have. But the idea of going to a farmer's market and trying to draw customers from another farm, I think is going to be really hard, because farm selling is very much a direct connection. It's like when I'm talking to you on this video, or if you're listening on the podcast version, it's me to you. You start to build a bit of a connection, a bond there. You're not just going to necessarily shift away because something's a little cheaper. So think about where you sit in the scheme of the market. And as you look around and like how premium you are, use that as pricing. If you price high and the market's generally busy, but you're not seeing a lot of volume, you have to start asking questions. Is it pricing? So are people stopping at the booth? This would be my thought process, and other farmers could chime in the comments. If I have a booth and nobody's stopping, then I say, all right, is it my display? Because if somebody doesn't stop, they don't like the look of how I'm presenting myself or how my product's presenting itself. If they stop, look around and move on, that could be pricing. That could be your product offering. You sell really obscure stuff. Somebody might just be like thinking, I don't know what any of this is. I don't know what to do with it. And then they move on. It could be the signage. It could be the look of the produce. Not just, I know what it is, but man, it looks dirty and gross. Or the person selling it looks dirty and gross. So if they're not stopping, then you need to ask, oh, okay, why not? Or if they stop and move on, why aren't they purchasing? Are they asking questions? Are they like looking at the price and being turned off? So you probably can start to ascertain whether your pricing is right or not. But I would argue that unless you're way out of bounds, so if the market's selling carrots at 4, I'd be willing to bet you could push it to 6 and sell carrots. $7, $8, you might really be getting there, but you got to come with the rest of the package. You can't look dirty. You have to be presentable. You have to be friendly. You have to converse with people. You have to be telling your story, listening, answering questions. Your produce has to look immaculate. Your booth has to look good. So you can probably push higher than the market, and that's where I would tend to go. Not necessarily be the most expensive, but be above average. Because you probably at least believe you are better than average. Otherwise, why are we doing this? Nobody wants to say, I'll open a farm and dang, it's going to be an average farm. Look at me, Mom. Aren't you proud? I have the most average farm in my county. Oh, you want to be better than someone else. Not just to say that they're terrible. I think that's a goal of anything. I want to do the best I can, and hopefully the best that I could do is better than what somebody else can do. So you want to be better, maybe not the most expensive, but maybe that works in your market. I've had farmers on the podcast say in the past that they like to have people feel a little bit uncomfortable about pricing. If people are turning over money too easily, it might be too cheap. I think we've all been there when we're in a negotiation or we buy something off OfferUp or Craigslist and you see something that you know is worth more than somebody's selling it for, and you make an offer, and let's say it's a low offer and they just take it. You're like, yes, I'll be there right now. Like, you don't even have to think. I've been in those types of deals buying stuff for around the house where you just know when it's too low, there's no friction, it's an easy sell. It's the times where you really got to think, I don't know. That's probably where you want to be pricing stuff, because you're not too expensive that they're immediately saying no, but you're not so cheap that the money just flies out of your pocket. Remember, the danger of being too cheap is you leave money on the table. If I sell for less, the only way to make more money is to grow more. And for most market farmers, we can't do that because we're limited in the land that we're farming, or we have to lower input costs. And you can only do that to a certain extent. The input cost on a lot of these crops anyway is low to begin with. It's mostly labor. So if you can control your labor costs, your cost on product is low. And we'll look at an example here coming up of radishes. But I think Curtis talked about a 25-foot bed of radishes had something like $4 in inputs when you look at seed and fertilizer, $20 in labor, and he could generate $250 in revenue off that bed. Mostly profit. Pricing will be one of the hardest things you'll need to figure out. There's a lot of great examples in the Farm Startup podcast that I did with Alex Smith last year in 2024. He talked about his farmers markets, and we started from his very first market and went all the way through the season. He talked about adjusting pricing. The other thing you can do is, it's this concept of fogging. Mentioned it a little bit earlier. Not dishonest, but I could price the same as somebody else, but maybe my unit size is a little bit less. Again, this will be hard to detect for the average person. If I sell a 12-pack of Coke and somebody else sells a 10-pack of Coke, I'm going to be able to tell and notice, oh, that's only a 10-pack, not a 12-pack. If you have 8 radishes per bunch on average and somebody else has 6, I don't know that anybody's going to be able to tell the difference between the sizes of the bunches because they don't deal in radishes a lot. So you could go down a little bit in unit size. This gains you a higher price per unit that you're selling. And it enables you to make more units to sell. So you can make up margin that way if you can't push prices higher. All things to think about. Pricing's not easy, but I think the takeaway here is don't just match your competitors. Don't be blind. You have to have a strategy. Know your costs, know where your competitors are, and then set your pricing according to where you think you fit into the market, and then observe and react. There's nothing saying that you have to keep prices the same every market. You could change prices every week. I don't think that's a bad thing. You have to react. You have to maneuver early on. If you're new to farming or new to that farmer's market, you have no frame of reference to go off of. So you have to give it your best guess, put it out there, see how the market reacts, and adjust. So I would have no qualms about constantly moving prices around till I felt like I found a sweet spot, playing with unit sizes. There's all sorts of little things you can do to hone in, but don't leave money on the table by selling too cheaply, and don't get in a race to the bottom by just trying to be the cheapest one. The other big part of this episode as we shift to the cost side was the great thing about small scale farming is it's human scale. And generally, it's low cost farming. Yes, infrastructure costs money. Yes, land costs money. So you're required to have some startup costs to get this stuff in place. You're not going to build a wash pack building for nothing. That costs money. But to grow a single crop, it's cheap. It's much cheaper percentage-wise for a farmer listening to this to grow a crop of Salanova than it is for me to make a product that I sell to a farmer. So my profit margin, what it costs me to make a product over what I sell it for, that is, or what percentage of cost, the sales price minus the cost, that's the profit. The profit divided by the sales price, that's the profit margin. My profit margin is most likely going to be way lower than a farmer. So farms are already working on high profit margins per crops. People have a hard time wrapping their head around that. These beds of vegetables can actually be 70, 80% profit. And it can be. Well, why? There's just not a lot of costs. What is your cost that goes into raising a crop? Labor, seed, some amendments, and water if you have to pay for that. A little bit of packaging. Those are the main things. Labor, by far the biggest expense. That goes from everything from seeding the crop to nursery care to weeding to harvest to wash pack. So Salanova seed, relatively inexpensive versus how much you can sell that product for at the end of the day. Your amendments, your fertilizer, your potting soil, if you're doing transplants, pretty low. Water, pretty low. So at the end of the day, you don't have a lot of costs. So if you're a farmer thinking about how do I control my costs, really think about how do you control labor? How do you remove labor from the farm? Anything you can do to stop a human from touching it will increase your profitability. So you shouldn't be doing tasks that don't pay. In Ben Hartman's world of lean farming, this is muda. Muda is waste. It's anything that doesn't contribute to value of the final sold product. So stop touching stuff. Look at your processes of how you do things and decide, is this step necessary? Should somebody do this? Because if it's not necessary and you're doing it, you're increasing costs for no gain. There isn't fuel usage here. You're not using a lot of equipment. You're not using electricity. Land costs, probably not high if you factor that in. And going back to that radish example that Curtis used in this episode, a 25-foot bed of radishes, he had about $4 in inputs. That's his seed and amendments, $20 in labor. Sold it for about $250 of revenue, $225 in profit. I don't know what that profit margin is off the top of my head. Is it like 85% or something like that? Very high. A lot of crops are going to be really high. So know your costs. Part of knowing your costs is timing, how long it takes to do things. So if I'm going to direct seed a bed, I should know approximately how long does that take. 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. If I hand transplant a bed, how long does it take? And then you can start to allocate, if you have an employee, their labor rate against that time. If you're paying yourself, which you should be doing and factoring in your time. This is a big mistake a lot of farms make, is they work for free. They don't pay themselves for their time. They donate their labor to the farm, which messes up their profit margins. So know your costs. The other thing you should think about here is pulling labor off. What are things you can do to not have to touch a crop? Landscape fabric's a great example. It's not a task that pays weeding. You have to weed, but weeding doesn't make your crop more valuable. It might make the crop possible, because if you have a weedy bed, you can't harvest salad mix through it. So it might enable the crop to be harvested, but it's not making, by doing the active step of weeding, it's not necessarily making the salad worth more. Maybe you could get more of it if it's not crowded out, that type of thing. I get it. So if I can eliminate the whole thing of weeding or dramatically reduce weeding through techniques like stale seed bedding, using a flame weeder, early thread stage weeding, landscape fabric, that saves me money in the long run. If I can find ways to harvest more efficiently, do things in wash pack that cut down on time, that makes me more profitable. So costs are a big part of this. If you're a farmer and you're not making as much money as you think, there's two places to look. One, am I spending too much money? And you could look at, are you just buying too much stuff? Are you spending too much on labor, yours or somebody else's? And the other problem is, am I not selling enough? And what I'm selling, am I not selling it for enough? Those are the two spots. That's basic business math. If you need to make more money, you need to sell more and or sell it for more or cut costs. Now, again, you could only cut costs so much, but there is often a lot of room within any business, including mine, where I can cut out costs by cutting out processes that don't add value. And over the last 6 months, I've tried to do that with my business. Take a look at things that we're doing that I thought were necessary, but really aren't. One question I like to ask is, if I didn't do this, would anybody notice? If it went away, would anybody care? And if nobody notices and nobody cares or complains that it's gone, why are you doing it in the first place? Every action in a business should have a very specific reason why you're performing it. And ideally, it's to take the product and make it more valuable, or take the raw material and upcycle it to finally get to the finished product. If it's not something you have to do to get a better product, don't do it. Now, there's obviously things we have to do, take out trash, fix things that break, but we're not including that. We're talking waste in the system. So check out books like The Lean Farm by the amazing Ben Hartman to learn more on that. The last thing I want to close on, employees. This is a big step for a lot of farms, is to finally hire an employee. And I think it's a scary step for a lot of farms to hire an employee. I know the first time I hired somebody, I was very nervous about it. In hindsight, I don't know why I was nervous about it. It wasn't that big of a deal, and it made my life so much easier. The great thing about having employees is you can have employees focus on something that they can do best, and you can focus on what you do best. And hopefully what you do best as the business owner is work on the business. And the main things you should be working on are the highest value tasks, things that bring in more customers, keep current customers happy, cut costs, improve productivity, look for new products, things like that. Make partnerships, form new relationships. You shouldn't be getting caught in the minutia, the day-to-day. That's not to say you shouldn't dip down there every once in a while to stay familiar and look for holes and bottlenecks. But that's not what you should do, because you weeding a bed isn't the best use of your time. Now, I get it. If you're a single person farm, one person running the farm, you have to do it all. But if you're one person doing it all, you have to be very selective. You only have so many hours a week to dole out. Think of them like playing cards in your hand. And you only have the 52 in the deck at the beginning of the week. Every time you do a task, you're putting cards into that pile. The more hours that task takes, the more cards that go into that task pile. Eventually you run out, and there may be important things you still need to do, but they don't have time. So you really need to stop sometimes when the chaos is going on around you and say, the best thing right now might not be to do more work. It might be to stop and say, what work should I actually be doing? If you want to be more productive as a business owner or a solopreneur, the single best way to do that is not to find out how to do more in a day. It's to find out what are the things you should be doing every day and what should you absolutely not be doing. Focus on what matters and don't do what doesn't. And this goes for employees. So if you're going to hire an employee, how I like to think about it is there's a value exchange there. You're hiring someone under the assumption that they can leverage what you're paying them in terms of output. If I pay somebody $20 an hour, I'm hoping they can bring me $40, $50, $60, $70, $80 an hour in output. I have to. Because I not only have to pay them, I have to pay their labor burden, taxes, I have to pay overhead on the business, I have to bring in inventory, do all those other things. So they can't just do $20 an hour worth of work. They have to value add. So if you're a farm looking to hire somebody, you got to say, what will this enable me to do? Can it free up hours for me, which I can then use those hours to grow the business, make the business more profitable, make the business more cost effective? Or can they do other things that I couldn't do by myself? So now we could never grow tomatoes before, but now we can, and that'll bring in $5,000 more a year in profit after their labor. Made that number up. But that's how you should think about it. People are scared about the cost of labor, but they're looking at it the wrong way. It's just like looking at the cost of food. You're going to pay the cost somewhere. And people listening to this will identify, if you don't eat good quality food, your body will break down and you'll pay medical costs later on. So why not just eat good quality food to begin with as part of a holistic routine to make yourself healthy? If you focus on the cost of labor, you're going to pay somewhere else. You're going to burn yourself out. And I've talked to business owners who are reluctant to hire somebody, and they're burnt out. They're frazzled. They aren't making as much money as they could. A lot slipping through the cracks. Where if they simply hired someone, it would take a lot off their plate and enable them to do more, relax a little bit, zoom out, and stop being on that hamster wheel, always trying to get stuff done. The great farmer Paul Grieve, who started Primal Pastures and Pasture Bird out here in Southern California, explained it this way, and I always really love this explanation. He said, look, if an employee comes into work and they have a set task to do, they just focus on that task. And hopefully they'll do the best they can on that one task. When you come in, if you were going to do that task as a business owner, you're trying to do that task plus all the other things you're going to do that day as a business owner. So are you going to give 100% into that one task, or are you just going to try and get it done good enough and move on? And I thought that was a great way to really think about this. Employees can really hone in and focus on what they do. That means you don't have to worry about that slice of the business. You can now focus on what you do best. If you had to focus on what you do best and what they do, by default, it dilutes out your time to focus on what you do best. It adds stress. It makes you more tired. It makes you physically tired. And it reduces the time you have, which makes it hard to do that part where you really value add. Getting more done isn't the best way forward. A lot of times it's reducing what we do, focusing on higher value things. And the way to do that, sometimes the only way to do that, is to hire employees. Those are some of the big lessons that I took out of this week's history of the urban farmer. And that was season 1, week 4. If you haven't listened to the episode, go back and listen to it. If you want to join me on a future episode of the Rewind, where we have these types of conversations about what we heard and our thoughts on them today. I had these conversations originally back in 2015. I've had hundreds more conversations since then, and I've learned a ton since then. So if I'm rehaving those conversations again with a new perspective, with more education, and hopefully that opens your eyes, gets you thinking, and join me for another future episode of the Urban Farmer Rewind. If you want to join me, leave a comment below. I'll be happy to have you on. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Until next time, be nice, be thankful, and do the work.